Okay. Well, good afternoon, and hopefully we'll provide some information that'll be useful to you and help you improve uh, some pasture and grazing management. There we go. And so what I'm going to spend the first half of the webinar today talking about are just some principles of grazing management, some things, key things that I think are worth consideration to help improve our ability to produce forage and to harvest it efficiently using livestock. And so that's kind of the focus of what I'm going to do today. And I would just want to start out with just a few pictures and ask a few questions. And so potentially, maybe some of you at home have a pasture that looks something similar to this. Not a lot out there. And I asked the question, if this is your scenario, why change management? And just some reasons that I've got. One, overgrazing is kind of hard on the plants overall. It reduces root growth and plant vigor. And what we end up with is poor productivity in the pasture. And along with that, there's just not a lot out there for animals to eat. And so it can definitely have a detrimental effect on animal performance. The other thing is when we overgraze, then we end up with more problems with erosion and weed invasion. And a lot of times I get calls at the office wondering about, how to control certain weeds in a pasture. And yes, we can address some of those things with herbicides, but reality is those are Band-Aids. And what we really maybe need to do is go back and look at management and address that situation there. If you've got a pasture at home that looks like this one, totally opposite of the one before, and I asked the same question, why change management there? And there's some issues if we undergraze and overrest things. And so we've got to consider that, because you end up with forage that's not nearly as good. The nutritional quality is lower, and animals really don't care for it. And sometimes we can even get some decadence in there, and it just kind of a decaying, the pasture's actually working towards a lower state. It's, I think of specifically one example that really comes to mind, south of Nampa, Idaho, in the Reynolds Creek area. Years ago, I was asked to help with a riparian issue up there to look at some, what kind of management changes were needed. And it was an area that they had fenced off the creek where it went through this ranch, simply because there were some issues with the stream banks and that, some erosion and just some cattle had used that pretty hard. And so they fenced it all off, and you think, well, that's a good solution, but yet when it wasn't grazed at all over a period of several years, those desirable plants got so big and wolfy, and then there was so much dead and decaying plant litter around, they were literally choking themselves out, opened up the ground to some weed invasion that way. And so it's just an example. This isn't the solution maybe either. And then a lot of pastures that we see around would look similar to this, where there's some areas that are overgrazed and some that are not grazed much at all. And so there's another thing. And so a lot of times within the same pasture, we get areas that are, or plants that are overgrazed, and their neighbors are under or overrested, undergrazed. And so that's an issue too. And so what I'm going to talk about is what can we do to maybe change some of this effect here. And so jumping back a step first, we look at, what is it that we're trying to do? If you're raising sheep or goats or any other animal, what's really the business? And really we're trying to grow grass and capture energy from the sun. That's the reality of it. And so if we've got plants out there, they can be pretty efficient at capturing that energy and then converting that energy into something useful. And so in the case, in our case here, we're hoping the plants can capture the energy, convert it into some grass and forbs, and then our animals can take that and convert it into meat and muscle and fiber and those kinds of things. So that's what we're after. And so ultimately we want to be able to do that, sell it at a profit, and that's what we're trying to do. And so in order to be effective there, we're going to try to minimize the amount of bare soil, keep the plants growing as rapidly as possible, keep forage quality high so that animals are consuming and growing and producing as best they can. And so, along that way, then we look at, how can we improve that whole cycle? And if we graze right, if we manage it right, we can promote good, healthy roots. We can promote quality forage and help the nutrients to cycle through the system very effectively. At the same time, we create a habit. We really need some good microbes and things beneath the soil. We've got to have some good habitat there for this whole cycle to function right. And on top of all of that, if we're doing a good job of managing on the grazing end, we can capture most of the nutrients right there in the pasture, and we're not going to see them leaving the site. And if we do a good job and we've got a good mix, we can definitely reduce the outside nutrients we need to produce. Our reliance on fertilizers and that, some good management can really reduce the need for some of those. And then the water cycle, another part of it that's very important. We've got good cover. We can catch the rainfall. We can get it in the ground rather than have it run off. And even if we're relying on irrigation, our artificial rainfall, we still can get that water in the ground rather than see it leave the property. And so we want to time our grazing, control our grazing, and promote good root structure underneath. And at the same time, when we do that, we're going to have less compaction and more organic matter. And all of those things then tend to increase our ability to hold the water, to collect water, all of that kind of stuff. So all of those things really play together in this whole cycle. So how do we do it? Looking for the silver bullet answer, okay? And I have to tell you that there's no silver bullet. There's no recipe. There's just too many things involved in order to be able to do that. We've got to make adjustments all along the way, monitor how things are going, and then adjust again. And so there just are a lot of things that change over time. And so what we do have are some tools and principles that can help us to do that. But I just, I can't give you a recipe to move animals into a pasture this day and take them out this day and, move them. It just, like I said, there's just too many variables to be able to do something like that. But we're going to talk about, some principles that can help you be able to accomplish the things that I've talked about earlier. So I'm just going to throw these up here really quick, and then we're going to take some time and go through each of these just a little bit more in depth. I would tell you that we're not going to go super in depth, and the reason being we could spend several hours on this topic alone. And so, but I will tell you in the end where you can come and get some additional training and understanding on this. But anyway, these are what we call the 5 principles of grazing. And when I say we, I'll back up and tell you that I'm part of a group that within the University of Idaho Extension folks that teach what we call the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy. And we do that once a year in the fall up in the salmon area. And it's just a great hands-on grazing school, if you will. And so if I talk about we, I'm speaking of the folks that have been involved in that program and that team of people. And so here's what we're going to talk about: adjusting the rest periods as the pasture growth rates change, using short grazing periods, fluctuating stocking rates, using the largest herd possible, and then using stock density as a tool. And so we'll spend a little time on each one of those 5 principles and before I turn it over to Melinda. And so here's principle number 1: adjusting the rest periods as the pasture growth rate changes. So pastures, I probably no secret, but they don't grow at the same rate all the time. Most of the pasture grasses we deal with in Idaho are cool season grasses. And so we typically see faster growth in the springtime. So as we come out of winter and move towards summer, that springtime, we call it, it's just a period of fairly rapid growth. And then as the weather gets warmer, it gets hotter out, middle of summer, July, August, kind of in that time frame, the growth rate really tends to drop off on those cool season grasses. And then when it cools down a little bit in the fall, we get a little bit of a bump there in the growth rates. And so as we try to manage that, we've got to plan for things. So when it's growing slow, it needs a long rest, meaning that from one grazing period to the next time we rotate in and graze that pasture or paddock again, it needs longer rest so that it can recover from being grazed. And springtime and any other period of faster growth, it needs a shorter rest. And so we're going to adjust things, try to adjust our management so that we provide long rest when it grows slow, short rest when it grows quickly. And so consider, if you would, for a minute, what is overgrazing? What does it mean to overgraze? Because you can go in, you could take animals in and graze a pasture way short, and it wouldn't necessarily be overgrazed. It might be severely grazed, but not necessarily overgrazed. It would only be overgrazed if we left the animals on there for an extended period of time, or we rotate them off, but we come right back before it has a chance to fully recover from that grazing event. And so there's a difference there. And so reality is overgrazing is not too many animals in a pasture. Okay, it's not the same as being overstocked. It's just not a thing about animal numbers. Okay. And so if we cut animal numbers, it's not necessarily going to fix a problem with overgrazing. Okay, so it doesn't just happen. It's a function of time. Okay, and so when we consider that, there's 2 things. One is the period of time that the animals are exposed to the plants. If they're left there too long, okay, that would be part of it. And then the other part would be the period of time that the plants are permitted to recover. So like I mentioned earlier, we can graze something severely, and then if we leave the animals on there, I mean, that's for an extended period of time, that definitely leads to overgrazing. Or if we, like I mentioned, rotate them off, but say, we come back in a week or come back in 2 weeks and it hasn't fully recovered, those 2 things can lead to overgrazing. And overgrazing does cause some problems. If you look at this chart, when we remove too much of the leaf volume, we get much beyond 50% of the plant, then we really start to lose root growth underneath the soil. And so when you consider root growth, there's a lot of truth to the old adage of take half, leave half. Can graze up to about half and really have little effect on the roots. But when you get over that, it just can severely start to cause problems. And this is just a picture. This is actually some riparian grasses, but it's out of a project for quite a ways back in Canada, where they just went in and repeatedly clipped these grasses to different heights. And notice, the stuff that was repeatedly clipped short, just the volume of roots there has really been reduced. And so that definitely can be just a good visual of the issues involved there. Okay. The other thing is that when we have to consider the growth rate, and I'm going to introduce the little terminology we call them, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of plant growth. And if you look at that, look at the red line there. When we graze plants, allow animals to graze pretty short into phase 1, that's a pretty flat growth rate there. Okay. In other words, if we take away too much leaf material, leaves being where photosynthesis takes place for the most part, when we take away that, the production factories, the energy capture factories, all of that, plants are slow to recover. And then as there is some additional leaf material, we get into phase 2, that growth rate really changes and speeds up considerably. And so anyway, and then if we let it go too long into phase 3, plants mature, they start to go to seed, it just really slows the growth rate. It drops back off. And so those are just some things to be aware of as we consider this. Okay. And if you look at, what's happening in phase 1, well, there just is not a lot of plant material there. It's low in quantity, but what is there is pretty high quality. And a lot of times you see animals go back to those areas because it's that young, very young, tender grasses, tender leaves. They're very high in protein, but there just isn't much out there. And so you're not going to feed very many animals. And if you look at that picture, in a lot of pastures that maybe have some phase 3 stuff, there also is, there's a ton of that phase 1 grass. And if we look at, here's a phase 3 pasture. So there's a lot of feed, okay, but the quality's lower. And you notice in that picture, as he's opened up that canopy, you see a lot of yellowed leaves and dying leaves. That understory is starting to, it just not getting the sun. Those older, they're just not got the same nutritive value. And so, there's a lot of feed, but the lower quality is going to have a negative impact on animal performance. And we see those again in that pasture that's, not managed terribly well. We see, a mix of phase 1 and phase 3 grasses. In phase 2, we're at a point where there's some good high quality grass. It's high in quantity, and we can put a lot of animals on there and expect that they're going to do quite well. And that picture is a straight orchard grass pasture, cowboy hat standing on end on its brim, but just to give you an indication of what's there. And so there was a lot of grass there, but this was actually being grazed by some cattle, and they were they rotated in the very next day. And so it was right there getting on the upper end of phase 2, but some really nice pasture. You know, what becomes challenging is going back to that discussion of, you know, the different growth rates in pasture, spring being rapid and summer or winter especially, not much growth going on there. But during all of those times, it's a moving target. And so for somebody that's trying to manage that, we have to make adjustments all along to try to manage, you know, balance the rest and recovery needed and balance what the animal's needs are. All right, principle number 2, shortest grazing periods possible. So there are 2 ways to overgraze, and you know, we mentioned the rest period being too short, being one of those. The other part is if we leave animals too long, and so, you know, a pasture starts to regrow. I mean, you could almost say immediately after it's bitten off, and so it's not like those plants stop and wait a few days. They're still trying to photosynthesize and do all that stuff. And so if we leave animals on there too long, they go back and they're grazing all that regrowth. That pasture is really not getting the opportunity to recover. And so that's what we're talking about here. If we use a short grazing period, we can get animals off of that, rotated to a new place, and it's having a chance to rest and recover. And so a lot of times, sometimes folks have a tendency to want to spread animals into a bunch of different groups. And I realize there are times, sometimes during breeding, and you have to breed to specific bucks or whatever. You know, there may be some times when, for management purposes, you have to. But if we can reduce the number of herds, then it gives us more of our pastures or paddocks that have a chance to rest. The other thing on the short grazing periods, it does affect the animals. And so if you look at this, you know, animals are selective binge feeders. What I mean by that is they don't plan for tomorrow, okay? They're gonna go through and they're gonna eat the very best stuff they come across, and they definitely are selective when they have the opportunity. And so in a pasture where it's essentially being continuously grazed, they eat the best stuff the first day, the second best the second day, and so on. Eventually the pasture reaches a, you know, wherever kind of the equilibrium and a much lower forage quality. If we were to do something like a 3-day rotation, they eat the best stuff the first day, the second best stuff the second day, and the third best stuff the third day, and on the 4th day they get rotated to the next grazing cell. And so from there, they're back on a higher plane of nutrition. And so when you look at it overall in this 3-day graze period scenario, they are at a much higher plane of nutrition. Therefore, that's really going to affect performance than on the continuously graze side. And so, you know, other things that happen, what reduces forage quality? Well, animals walk on it. They foul it with manure and urine. And as those things happen, then forage quality and intake, forage quality declines and animal intake goes down. Okay, so the longer that animals stay on the less forage lower quality that they consume. Okay, and that has an impact on animal performance. So how do we fix that? Well, typically, you know, it's going to take at least 4 to 10 paddocks to have enough to rotate and recover in order to be able to get past that. If you really get serious, you know, having 16 to 20 or even more can help to really keep things at their best level. Other things to consider, animals' energy demands are different. So when I pull all these up, if you look at that, at what point do animals need their highest energy? Well, it typically comes with lactation. And so lactating animals need the highest nutrients, and as well as finishing animals. If you're working to grass finish some lambs or goats or whatever, you've got to have some high quality pasture and some good forage availability, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Got dry animals, then we're on the low energy requirement side of things, and then there's stuff in the middle. And so you just have to stop and consider and balance things. But if you're really after that high production, it definitely calls for a higher level of management. Okay, principle number 3. That is adjusting the stocking rate to match the carrying capacity. And so when you look at those, the carrying capacity would be stocking at a level where you achieve the animal goals, your performance goals, and you maintain the integrity of the resource. Okay. Melinda is going to spend some more time talking about that here in a few minutes, but that's that. Stocking rate being how much feed you take. So you look at how much is out there, how much you take, and really, ultimately, we'd like to see those two balance and equal each other. And like I said before, it's some of these concepts are really simple, but it changes all the time. So there's that how much feed's out there just is never going to be a constant thing. And so those plant growth rates and what do we do to try to manage some of those differences? And I put up here use of the 3 banks. And so, when you don't have enough feed out there, maybe you got to dip into Wells Fargo hay bank or something. But the hay bank is one of them. So we use that to try to balance when we don't have enough forage in the pasture. Can we fill in some gaps with some hay? I mean, we definitely do that over the winter time, and sometimes it might even pay to supplement a little bit with some hay in the summertime when we give a pasture a chance to rest and recover. Just food for thought. So the hay bank's one of those things, and I think I hid the other couple of slides, but one of them's the feed bank. Sometimes we can stockpile feed, leave some to grow more and mature more that we go back in either late fall, winter time, whatever, we can go back and graze those areas. And the third one being, I honestly don't know how applicable this would be to the sheep and goat arena. I spend most of my time with cattle, but is the fat bank. And the fat bank being that where we basically, we're feeding a little below, over the winter time, we're feeding a little below the animal's actual requirements so that they can burn up a little bit of the fat on their backs. And especially in irrigated pasture, it's typical for cattle to come in packing some excess fat. And so if we melt a little bit of that off over the winter time, not an issue at all. So ultimately, though, we're trying to match what the needs of the animals are to what's available, and we have to consider, maybe some things to consider. If you're lambing or kidding way early in the year, the idea being that you can wean heavier animals, okay, then we're stuck using the hay bank typically when the nutrient demand is the highest. And if we were to shift a little bit, so to a later date, there's the potential of getting off of that, or maybe not relying quite so heavily on the hay bank and having animals more closely match what I would say is Mother Nature. when the green grass is coming on, if we've got their highest nutrient demand at that point in time, then we can reduce some of that hay we feed. Okay, and so anyway, that's just some food for thought there. Principle number 4, I alluded to earlier, but it's using the largest herd possible. So when we do that, when we can bunch animals together, then we've got more paddocks and or pastures that are at rest, and we also increase the stock density, which I'm going to talk about in more detail here in just a minute. Okay, and it does give us the chance, and we bunch animals together, sometimes it's appropriate to really get after an area. Let's say there's an area that is just got some really rank grass, forb, shrubs, whatever in it, or an area that's heavily infested with some overly mature weeds or whatever, and you're just wanting to really knock that down and take care of it. You know, if we pile some animals in there, a lot of times it's a kind of a non-technical solution. We can really reduce the stuff that's there and be able to go back and then reseed and do some things to help improve that. Then principle number 5 is using the highest stock density possible. And we're looking there at basically when we put animals into a smaller space, okay, it does a couple of things. And one of the things is it increases the uniformity of grazing. When animals are kind of packed into an area, they're less worried about, you know, selecting out the best bites of grass or forbs or whatever, and they're more concerned about just beating their neighbor before the neighboring animal gets it. And so you can really change how a pasture is grazed just by, you know, moving animals into a smaller space and increasing the stock density on a piece of whatever the pasture or paddock is, increasing the stock density for that period of time. The other thing that does is improve the distribution of manure and urine. So you get a much more even distribution when the stock density is high than when it's low. And, you know, a lot of that manure and urine gets all of the nutrients get picked up all over the pasture, and then the animals take them to water, and if there's shade available, they go to those places and deposit them all. And so you really get a shift of nutrients over time. So it's anyway, this great potential there. And if you consider for a little bit stocking rate and stock density, okay, they kind of sound the same, but it's quite different in the actual application. Because if you look at this, okay, so if we put one animal on 1 acre and leave it there for 100 days, okay, we would have what we call 100 animal days per acre, okay? But if we take 100 of those animals and we put them on 1 acre for 1 day, we also have 100 animal days per acre. So the stocking rate is 100 animal days per acre, but the stock density is considerably different. And the effects on, you know, what that's going to do to a pasture, what it's going to do to uniformity of grazing, improvements of manure distribution, all those kinds of things, going to be vastly different. The key to the 100 animals on 1 acre for a day is simply going to be that's a 1-day deal. It's a short graze, and then you move those animals to the next, you know, you rotate them to the next pasture paddock. And so those, just some stock density, just a great tool. Well, how do we increase stock density? You know, in most places, it's not very desirable to go build miles and miles of permanent fencing, but we can, and we do use a lot of portable electric fencing. And you'll notice that, you know, these pictures are more a cattle setup where we can get away with just a single strand of electrified poly wire. But I realize with sheep and goats, we'd have to do a little bit more there. But that's the idea. If we, with portable electric fencing, it gives us it's just a great tool to really be able to put, to increase stock density, to adjust paddock sizes and pastures, and, you know, in order to be able to better manage the grazing. And with the right equipment and a little bit of practice, I can tell you, you can put these up and take them down in very little time at all, and really can be a game changer. You know, how high is too high when it comes to stock density? It's going to be dependent on several things, but I'm telling you that on good irrigated pasture, 50 to 100,000 pounds of live weight per acre is not out of the question, or not unreasonable. Really can pack those animals in. Again, the key is that to use a high stock density, and then you rotate those animals to the next grazing cell. You know, depending on how you've set it up, maybe it's 1 day, maybe it's 3 days, whatever. But that's the idea behind it all. If you're on a dry land site, it's not very practical to get up to that same level. But I will tell you, I know a beef producer in Owyhee County that practices some what we call management intensive grazings, uses some high stock densities on rangeland situations, using some herding and other things. And he's made some incredible improvements in his rangeland just by following these principles. And even though he uses high stock density in a given spot, he's rotating those animals usually within 2 to 3 days to the next place, and and allowing those areas to rest and recover. Just done some amazing things. Even won a national stewardship award from the BLM for what he's accomplished. So just in reviewing these principles, got to adjust things, just the rest period as the growth rate changes. We got to use the shortest grazing period possible, adjust the stocking rate, use the largest herd possible, and then use the highest stock density possible. So where can you learn more about it? Where can you get a little practical, hands-on experience? I'd invite anybody that has an interest to attend the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy. It'll be held this year. The dates are September 15th to the 20th. We hold it up in Salmon, and it just is a great opportunity to actually get out on the ground and try to practice some of these principles. We take the folks that come and divide them up into teams, and then they're each given a ranch, a piece of ground, some pasture, and some animals, and you get a grazing objective. You build a paddock, put the animals on, go back the next day, and see how well you accomplish that objective. It just is a great mix of classroom and hands-on, and really gives you a chance to try to practice some of these principles. And so if you have any interest, check out our Facebook page on that. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to send you a brochure about it. It really is a good school. And I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass this over to Melinda, and then she can take the baton and go from there.
I'm going to build off of everything that Scott was telling you, and really kind of get to the nitty-gritty about how do we actually know how many animals to put in a pasture. So of course, he already touched on what a stocking rate is, number of animals that a pasture can support over a given period of time. And if we want to calculate that, we need to have information on the average size of our animals. We need to know what the total forage production is per acre in our pasture, and also the size of the pasture. And there are, you know, in some cases going to be parts of that pasture that are not accessible to the animals. So for example, somebody who's out on rangeland and there's a big outcrop of rocks, or there's down timber somewhere, those are all places that maybe an animal is not going to want to go. So you would not include that when you're looking at information on the size of your pasture. So I'm going to give you two methods that can get you down to the actual forage production that might be occurring in your pasture. Taking vegetation surveys that we're going to talk about on this slide is probably going to be your most accurate, but it is also going to be time consuming. So just so you know that this method is available to you. If you're really serious about understanding your forage production, this is a great way to do it. So what you do is you take a frame that's of a known size, and then you clip everything that's within that frame down to about 3 or 4 inches high. And that'll give you an idea of how much forage is within that frame. You want to take an average from several different sites. I suggest at least 3, if not more, depending on the size of the pasture, and you want to get a good representative sample. So if your pasture is variable in the types of forages that are out there, you want to make sure that you're taking samples from all of those spots so that you have a representative idea. For sheep and goats, you pretty much can clip anything in the frame. If you're going to take the forbs and the grass, that's great. I don't usually recommend using any of the shrubs or trees or anything like that within your frame. However, we do know that goats especially are going to eat some of that shrub. So if you want to get really nitty-gritty when it comes to goats, you only want to clip the new year's growth on shrubs, because that's all that they're probably going to eat for the most part. So anyway, you can send it to somebody like myself at the university, and we can do it in our fancy forage dryer. If you have some time before you're going to turn out, you can air dry it out in the sun. And then there's a method for putting samples in the microwave. So you record your total clipping weight for any of these methods, and then you can take a subsample as long as you know what it weighs before. If you know what the whole sample from within that frame is before, and then also the subsample, so you want to have that wet weight. So then when you dry it, you can take the calculation as a percentage of the wet, and that's your dry matter. So we'll get into that in a minute, but so with the microwave, you can take a subsample of your clippings. You can dry them 1 to 2 minutes at a time, and if you throw a cup of water in there with it as you're drying it, it won't light on fire. And then you want to do 1 to 2 minute spurts until the last 2 times that you weigh, they're the same both times. So that would be a good estimate of whether or not it's dry. And then what you do, of course, like I mentioned, is you take that dry weight after you microwave it or dry it in air drying or whatever it is that you've done, and you divide that by the wet weight and multiply by 100, and that gives you your dry matter percentage. And then you take that percentage and multiply it with the total that you got out of the frame. So for this example, this is my frame. It's 1 yard by 1 yard. And I clipped 0.98 pounds out of that wet weight. And then when it was dry, it came out to 0.83. So that's just an example. You can use any size frame that you want. A yard is just easy to translate into an acre. So all you have to do then, once you have your dry weight within that 1 yard square frame, you can multiply it by 4,840, and you get your total pounds per acre. So in this case, for this example, we have 4,000 pounds per acre of forage available, dry matter. So another method that you can use, it's not quite as accurate, but it's much easier to do. You can take your measuring stick out into the pasture with you, and you can get an ocular average height. So basically what you do, you put your tape measure out at arm's length, stick it in the grass, and you're going to take the last number that you can see clearly, because the idea then is that you have all of your plant matter is below that. So in this case, probably 17 in this photo. So you want to take 15 to 20 random measurements across your pasture so you can get a good average. And then you estimate the plant density, which is essentially saying how much bare ground is in, when I look straight down, how much bare ground versus grass. And if your stand density is pretty thick and you can't see the ground very well, you're going to say, or you can't see the ground at all in this case, you're going to say it's above 90% density, right? So you have to kind of have an eye for that and figure that out. So it takes a little bit of practice, but then you can apply those measurements to the table that I have listed here. So in this case, I had to remember what I did. So in this case, I'm going to say we measured on average 10 inches of grass, and we're going to say that it's this tall fescue with some legumes in it. It's greater than 90%, so I'm going to just estimate it at about 400. So then you just take 10 inches times 400 pounds per acre, because each one of those here is for 1 inch. And so the same as the last time, just for the sake of ease as I go forward, we're going to come to about 4,000 pounds an acre. So I recognize that most of the forages on this list are going to be improved pasture forages. Certainly feel free to touch bases with me if you want to try to do something like this on different types of grasses or different rangelands or whatever it may be. We can help you get a better estimate of your forage production. So then you want to take that size of pasture, and of course remember to subtract any areas that are not going to be grazed or used by animals. And then you simply just extrapolate your pounds per acre times the number of acres that you have. So my pasture in this example, at 4,000 pounds per acre, we're going to have 40,000 pounds per acre for the whole pasture. And that's dry matter, remember, when we're talking about that. So now we have a good understanding of what our pasture is made up of, and we know that we have our average animal size is 150 pounds, and we have to incorporate a grazing utilization. And so you really just want to try to remember not to take more than 50% in most cases. So to be able to account for the 50% grazing utilization, we're only going to take 50% of the total forage available. So we had 4,000 pounds an acre, 10 acres, and we're going to multiply that by 0.5 as our 50% grazing utilization value. So really, all that we want to remove from that pasture is 20,000 pounds of forage. Then we have to understand how much each animal is going to eat, and as an average, you can assume over a month's time they're going to eat 80% of their body weight. So if they're 150 pounds multiplied by 0.8, you're going to assume that they'll eat about 120 pounds of dry matter per month. So if that's the case, we have 20,000 pounds per acre, or in the pasture. I apologize, I made a mistake there. Divided by 120 pounds per month for one animal, that gives us an estimate of being able to turn 166 animals per month into that pasture. So we've estimated that, but maybe we have a set number of animals that we have, and we have to decide how long they should be there. So say we have 200 animals, you can take that stocking rate of 166 animals and divide by 200, and that tells you how long they can be there to eat the amount of forage that you want them to eat. So in this case, 0.83 months equals 25 days. Or you might have a set duration of time that you want to use. And this could apply whether you're trying to utilize the forage in 2 days or 2 months or whatever it may be. And so you take that number of stocking rate, 166 animals, divided by the number of months. So, of course, if you have a couple days, it's going to be point whatever months, right? And that'll give you an estimate of how many animals you need to eat that down in that period of time. The other thing is you can back calculate, which I'm happy to help you with. I haven't given you an example, but you can back calculate to say, I have this many animals, I want to be here this many days, how big of a pasture do I need to achieve that? And then you can go back and build your pasture within a pasture so that you're hitting that higher stocking rate that Scott was talking about. But I'm a realist, so I also recognize that many of you are probably not going to do the two things I just mentioned to get to your forage production and measure and calculate and do all of that. So if you want to be the person that turns your animals out and just monitors how long it takes them to get there, that's great. But I do not recommend doing that just by looking at it because it's really hard to estimate. So I always recommend go out, measure the height of the plants before you turn out. And as long as you have some idea of what plants you have out there, you can use existing growth curves for species of plants. And that's pretty easy to just Google growth curve for Timothy or whatever it may be. And it can give you this idea. So you're starting at 23.5 inches, 50% use of this plant is down to 4 inches because as Scott mentioned, your majority of your plant is at the lower part of the plant. So it takes more than like 50% of the actual height to reach 50% utilization. I hope that makes sense. But if you have an idea of that growth curve and you can go out and measure every day and see where you're at, you can pull those animals off when they reach a certain grazing level. The one thing I did want to mention briefly is rule of thumb on most species of grasses. Don't ever graze off more than 4 inches, especially if you're grazing those pastures. They're wet, you're moving through them pretty regularly, because this is when you're going to start to have more trouble with parasites. So the parasite, if you only graze for 3 or 4 days, by the time that the animals have sloughed out any fecal parasites, you're off before they lay their larvae and the animals can pick them back up. And so if you're on that wet, irrigated pasture that you're moving through, there's more than one reason to only stay on for a short period of time, and that's one of them. Also, most of the worm larvae that are going to be on those grasses are going to be on the lower 3 to 4 inches of the plant. So that's why you want to make sure to leave at least 4 inches, because the odds of your animals picking up that larva are lower. And then the cycle, depending on the type of worm that's out there, is 4 to 8 weeks. And so having that longer regrowth period also decreases the chances of those larvae to still be there when you return to that pasture. So just something to keep in mind. In addition to plant health and pasture rotation management, that parasites also play a role, and that's why some of these strategies are going to work better for an irrigated pasture than others. So now you guys have an idea of how to make sure that you're grazing only what you're supposed to be grazing and how to stock those pastures, calculate all the numbers and everything. So again, we have to understand our forage production, the type and size of our animals, and you know, with the pastures, any terrain and dispersion issues that you have, you can take out of your calculations. If you have a lot of different types of forages out there, it could affect the way that you stock things, especially if you're maybe going to be out there for a longer period of time, or maybe you're having multiple animals using that pasture, multiple species of animals. The other thing is if you're in a small area, you have to account for some trampling that might occur, because just from the sheer walking around and laying down perspective, you're going to lose some of that forage to that. And so my rule of thumb is usually 10 to 20% if I'm in a small area, that I just add that to my utilization. So, and then the other thing that I'm going to discuss in more detail now is having different animals out on the range. So the nice thing about adding species, and I know some of you do this already, and some of you might think about it after today, but the nice thing about sheep and goats is they really have some overlap, but they still prefer different types of forages. So goats are going to be more browsers. They're going to be opportunists. Whatever's out there, they're going to eat, but if they have brush to eat, they'll probably eat that first. Sheep are intermediate. They'll eat some grass and some shrubs, but they primarily prefer forbs. And then cattle are going to mostly browse on grasses, and horses fall kind of in that grass category as well. So if you want to combine some of these animals in your grazing strategy, the nice thing is that you really actually can boost your stocking rate because they're not eating the same thing. So some of the benefits you might get to grazing multiple species at the same time is you can improve your forage and plant species diversity, because you're going to be grazing a bigger variety of types of plants. So for example, if you have some brush or weeds coming into your pasture and this is where you normally graze your horses or your cattle, add those sheep and goats in there and they can help with some of that invasive control. And you can, again, increase your carrying capacity up to 20% in some cases. The other thing is with predators, having those bigger animals in with your sheep and goats will sometimes decrease your chance of having predator issues. And then I'm going to get into parasite management, but you know, sheep and goats and horses and cattle all are affected by different types of parasites. And so you can use different grazing strategies to help decrease the parasite load that each one of your livestock species may run into on your pastures. And then for anybody who's trying to make money, which is what we all do when we raise livestock, right? Having multiple products in common, you're raising more income on less land when you do it this way. So just briefly, I'm going to get into some grazing behavior, but as we know, sheep are pretty selective, but they do have about a 35% overlap with cattle, which is not very high if you think about it. So that's where you get that bump in stocking rate when you graze them together. If your pasture is not very diverse and all you have is grass, your overlap is going to be higher between your sheep and cattle. But if you have a nice diversity, you can get a broader graze on that pasture by putting them together. And then for rangeland scenarios, sheep are willing to traverse slopes of up to 45%. And they don't really like hanging out in those bottomlands. And so your cattle who like to be on the lower ground and it's more flat where they prefer to be, and they do like those bottom wet riparian area type grazing. And so what happens is you end up having your cattle down low grazing those lower parts of the pasture in the riparian, and your sheep are going to get up and away from that up on the hillside. So you get a better utilization of the pasture by combining the two. Goats are great because they will browse on shrubs, and the way that they are able to do that and have in their digestive system the ability to detoxify some of those compounds that are in shrubs, they're able to eat things that other livestock species are not, and in addition to that, they prefer them over other things. And so this is where you can use that targeted graze with goats, and you know, if you're a goat producer and you're looking out into somebody's pasture and they're starting to get a shrub problem, maybe you drive in there and offer some goat grazing, targeted grazing for them in their cattle pasture. So there's some really great opportunities for goats in even a neighboring operation. And you guys know grass is the primary choice of horses and cattle, and they like to hang out on that lower ground, as I mentioned. So just an example here, if you have a really good pasture with lots of diversity, you know, you can put 1 cow to 5 goats to 6, or sorry, 5 sheep to 6 goats. So you can have all 3 of those in the same pasture and be able to utilize that pasture. Again, more goats if you get into some of that brush maintenance and eradication, or maybe you have a weed problem, which we'll also talk about in a second. So the nice thing is cattle diets will not change much no matter who's out there. So they're going to eat pretty much what they're going to eat. But goats and sheep will change the way that they graze based on the other animals that are in the pasture with them. So if you have cattle out there and they're mostly grazing grass and you throw some sheep in there, the sheep are going to try to eat down the forbs and weeds and that kind of thing, more so than they would if they were in there by themselves. Here's another example of putting sheep and cattle together. The orange is sheep grazing alone, the blue is cattle grazing alone, and the purple is when they're grazed in common. As you can see, sheep don't eat a lot of grass when they're by themselves, but cattle do, vice versa with the forbs. And then the sheep, of course, do a little more browsing than the cattle do. But when you graze them in common, you're getting a pretty even graze across the landscape. Another nice thing about commonly grazing sheep and goats and cattle and whatever else you might have is that sheep and goats like weeds, right? So you can put them out there and they'll do some targeted grazing to control some of those invasives that you're getting, and also some invasive annual grasses. Sheep and goats are great for trying to eradicate cheatgrass. We talked a little bit about parasites already, that they're specific to species. And so when you're grazing cattle and sheep, for example, or goats and cattle, you want to send the cattle into a pasture first, because the cattle are going to remove the grass that the parasites are hanging out on, and then you can send your sheep and goats in to collect all the forbs and browse and weeds and that kind of thing. The nice thing about goats is when they're grazing on the shrubs and that type of thing, they're a lot less likely to pick up parasites. And so if you're having an issue with parasites in your goats, it's probably because they're having to graze grass rather than other options. So a couple of different types of management that you could potentially use that are helpful grazing different species. The rotational graze, like I said, you have those lowland and riparian areas used by cattle, and the sheep can use the upland. So you can either graze them in common, or in this case, you would graze cattle 1 year followed by sheep the next year, or cattle 1 month followed by sheep the next month, or whatever it may be. That's an option. If you graze the sheep and goats prior to grazing cattle, this is a great way to work on your weed problems. So especially anything that might be toxic to cattle is usually not quite as toxic to sheep and goats. So for example, larkspur, you have to have a huge dose of larkspur before a sheep will have too much trouble with it, whereas cattle will have some issues more quickly. And so some of the types of weeds that are out on the range or out in your pasture, if you graze the sheep through first, your cattle are going to have less issues with them. We talked about predator control, grazing animals in common, increasing your utilization and grazing distribution. And then finally, graze your cattle before sheep and goats if you're trying to control parasites in your sheep and goats. So last slide here, just some things to think about as you're managing your grazing. And I always recommend building a grazing management plan prior to grazing, so you have a good idea of what you're going to do and what your goals are. and being able to use all the resources that you have available to you. So did you achieve your goals? Did you use the resources that were available? If you had to make improvements, did you get a good return on those improvements? And, you know, always thinking about economics as well. So just some thoughts to think about there. And with that, we can take any questions that you guys might have.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so the problem we have with our pasture a lot of the time is that we have mixed grasses, but the sheep seem to prefer the bluegrass. And so when we're trying to get them to graze more uniformly, we put more in there, but it just seems like they just graze that bluegrass to like a quarter of an inch before they'll even touch the other stuff. How do you recommend just like mowing everything else that they won't eat, or what are we doing wrong there?
So I'm not a big fan of mowing. I mean, it certainly could do that to get things even back out, but I really try to force animals onto it. And so the best way I could tell you would be to increase the stock density even higher than what you've done. You know, shrink up the size of the area they're grazing at that one time, and really force them. Essentially, you force them onto it. I've had some. I mean, I don't think there's any grazing that's ever perfect, and I would say the same. I had a challenge at my place where I have an area where years ago the ditch used to flood quite a bit, and it wiped out a lot of the grass, but it really I had in that area quite a bit of buckhorn plantain, and I don't know what it is about buckhorn plantain, but I'll tell you, cows love it, and they would go in those areas and graze all that to the dirt before they would touch anything else. And so I mean, sometimes it definitely provides some challenges. And again, you know, my best solution on solving my issue was just decreasing the size of the area and bumping up the stock density at any given time. And it still hasn't been perfect, but I have been able to let those areas get rested a little more.
Okay, thanks. We were worried about overgrazing the bluegrass since it gets eaten down so short, but maybe we don't worry about it and just stock even more. Okay, thank you.
And I would tell you one additional thing I would tell you about bluegrass. Bluegrass is one of the species that is pretty grazing tolerant. And so if you look at the physiology of bluegrass, the growing points of bluegrass are very low. And typically what I mean, I deal more with cattle and horse owners than anything, but I typically tell them if you've got bluegrass, it's because you are overgrazing the other more desirable species. And so just because the bluegrass can tolerate that, we see it move into a lot of pastures here that people plant, you know, orchard grass and other species, and then within 3 or 4 years, it's predominantly bluegrass and white clover. And it just comes from those are two plants that are very adapted to short grazing. You still, even in a bluegrass pasture, they can still be fairly productive, but you know, they need some residual too, where normally on an orchard grass pasture, I would shoot for around a 4-inch residual height at the end of a grazing period. Bluegrass you can graze it, you know, maybe down to a 2-inch average and still keep it fairly productive. But it definitely can tolerate some short grazing.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks very much.
You bet.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. popping up on my screen, so I guess we'll end the webinar for today. But next week, for those of you guys interested, we'll have a sheep industry update from Sarah Smith, who's with Washington State Extension. She's a regional specialist in livestock meat quality. And specifically, she'll also be talking a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted the sheep industry and kind of what producers can look for in the future as far as the market might be changing, things like that. So log in next week if you're interested in that. We'll be at 12:30 p.m. again, Mountain Time. And the Zoom links will be on the Facebook page, the Facebook group, and then probably in the out to the email list as well.